Power today is not announced. It is enforced. Sometimes it looks like an oil tanker stopped in open water. Not sunk, not hidden, seized, and then quietly sold back into the market. That single act tells you more about the global order than 1,000 speeches. Energy is not just fuel. It is the foundational brick of societies. When someone controls it, everything else begins to bend. Trade, diplomacy, even technology. In this system, rhetoric is cheap. Only leverage matters. China consumes most of Venezuela's oil, yet watches its supply vanish without a single ship moving to stop it. That silence is not restraint. It is a limit. If you want to understand how power really works in 2025 and why some empires sound loud but move little, stay with me. Because once energy becomes a weapon, the rules you thought governed the world no longer apply. And that brings us to the real question. How did we get here? What you are watching is not chaos. It is structure. Modern power no longer relies on invasion. It relies on control without occupation. Energy flows, shipping lanes, payment systems, supply chains. These are not economic details, they are governance tools. When oil can be intercepted far from any border, jurisdiction becomes flexible. When sanctions decide who may buy and who may sell, markets stop being neutral. They become instruments. The mistake many people make is to treat each event in isolation. A seized tanker here, a blocked shipment there, a sanction, a warning, a press statement. But systems don't work that way. They operate through repetition and predictability. Once actors understand who can enforce rules and who cannot, behavior adjusts automatically. No shots fired. No announcements needed. This is why silence matters as much as threats. And why energy sits at the center of everything that follows. To see the full mechanism, we have to step backward into history. Because this structure didn't appear overnight. This system has a history, and history explains why some moves look sudden but are anything but. For decades, energy security decided which nations could act freely and which could not. Those who produced and protected their supply dictated terms. Those who depended learned to adapt or comply. Over time, control shifted away from territory and toward infrastructure. Ports mattered more than borders. Shipping lanes more than flags. Financial clearing more than treaties. This is how energy stopped being a commodity and became leverage. Venezuela sits at the center of this evolution, not because of ideology, but because it holds the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, a resource too big to ignore and too exposed to protect. As global competition intensified, access replaced ownership as the real prize. Whoever could interrupt the flow legally, militarily, or financially gained the upper hand. That's why enforcement moved offshore. And why seizures didn't need permission. The system was already built. It was only waiting to be used. And when it was activated, the first real shock followed. Then the system stopped being theoretical. Oil shipments tied to Venezuela were intercepted far from land, not during war, not during blockade, on open water. Tens of millions of barrels already contracted, already destined, were taken out of circulation and redirected. Not frozen, not destroyed. Sold at market price? That detail matters because it reveals intent. This wasn't punishment, it was conversion. Energy was turned from someone else's lifeline into immediate leverage. The message was unmistakable. Control the flow, and you control the outcome. China watched this happen while consuming the vast majority of Venezuela's exports. There was no escort, no countermove, only protest. That silence echoed louder than any threat. If power is measured by what you can stop, not what you can say this moment, exposed a boundary that rhetoric could not cross. If this pattern feels unsettling, it should. Because once energy can be seized and monetized without resistance, no supply line is truly secure. And that leads to the deeper question, what mechanism makes this possible at scale? That mechanism is hidden in plain sight. The mechanism is not brute force. It is predictability. Power works best when it doesn't need to be explained. At the center of this system is a simple rule. Whoever controls the choke points controls behavior. Shipping lanes decide whether energy moves. Sanctions decide who is allowed to buy it. Financial systems decide whether payment even counts. None of this requires invasion. It requires compliance. Once the rules are enforced a few times, actors begin to self-regulate. Insurers pull back, ports hesitate, banks delay, captains reroute. The system starts enforcing itself. This is why seizures matter less than the precedent they create. When oil can be taken, resold, and normalized, risk is reassigned. Not to governments, but to anyone who touches the supply chain. And that's where silence becomes strategy. If a state cannot protect flows beyond its borders, its partners absorb the risk instead. Over time, access shrinks without a single new rule being written. What looks like dominance is actually design. And once this design is understood, retaliation begins to look very different. Because the next crisis doesn't target oil. It targets something even more sensitive. The second shock didn't come from the sea. It came from the ground. Rare earths materials so small they're measured in grams, yet so critical they power militaries, satellites, and advanced industries suddenly became restricted. Exports were cut, uses were narrowed, and the warning was explicit. Violate the rules, and punishment follows anywhere in the world. This was economic warfare, stripped of disguise. Japan felt it first. Shipments worth tens of millions halted. Supply chains tightened overnight. The message was not subtle. Alignment has a cost. But this move exposed another boundary. Weaponizing rare earths assumes the other side has no alternatives and no memory. Yet history had already shown that such bans collapse once markets adapt and pressure reverses. Still, the escalation mattered because it confirms something deeper. When energy leverage weakens, pressure shifts to minerals. When minerals strain, pressure moves again. The battlefield keeps changing. The objective does not, and while states trade blows at the top, the real weight of this system begins to fall somewhere else entirely. It falls on people who never chose this conflict. That is where the next consequence lands. And this is where you enter the story. Because when energy is restricted, minerals are weaponized, and technology is rationed, the shock does not stay at the top. It moves downward. It shows up as higher prices you didn't cause, as instability in industries you rely on, as jobs that suddenly feel less secure, not because of failure, but because supply chains broke somewhere far away. You're told this is abstract. It isn't. When systems lose trust, costs rise. When costs rise, households absorb them. And when uncertainty becomes permanent, planning for the future becomes harder for families, for businesses, for entire societies. This is what leverage does when it's normalized. It turns ordinary life into collateral. If you feel the ground shifting, you're not imagining it. You're living inside a system where power is exercised quietly and paid for loudly. If this perspective matters to you, pause for a moment. Share it. Because understanding the system is the first defense against being trapped inside it. And now we need to zoom out, because this pressure doesn't stop at borders. It reshapes the entire global order. When leverage works in one place, it rarely stays there. What begins as a seizure, a ban, or a payment condition quickly turns into a signal. Markets read it, allies adjust to it, rivals plan around it. Energy control in one region reshapes diplomacy in another. A mineral restriction aimed at one country forces diversification everywhere. Technology gatekeeping accelerates alliances and fractures others. This is how local pressure becomes global architecture. States that once assumed neutrality now calculate exposure. Companies redesign supply chains, not for efficiency, but for survival. Governments trade short-term growth for long-term security. The result is not collapse. It is reordering. Influence concentrates around those who control fundamentals, energy, materials, technology, and enforcement credibility. Those without them lose room to maneuver even if they remain loud. This is why global tension feels permanent. Not because conflict is constant, but because uncertainty is. And once uncertainty becomes structural, the future stops being linear. It branches. What happens next depends on how this system evolves and how far it is pushed. That brings us to the crossroads. 3 paths forward. From here, the system can move in 3 directions. The first is managed pressure. Leverage remains, but it is used selectively. Energy flows adjust. Supply chains diversify. Tension stays high, yet predictable. In this path, power disciplines behavior without breaking the system that sustains it. The second path is fragmentation. Trust erodes faster than alternatives can be built. Energy blocks harden, technology ecosystems split. Trade becomes conditional, political, and expensive. The world still functions, but at higher cost and lower cooperation. Then there is the third path, escalation without exit. Here, every choke point becomes a weapon. Energy, minerals, food, technology, all politicized. Retaliation compounds. Markets seize up not from shortage, but from fear. This is the most dangerous outcome, not because it guarantees collapse, but because it removes flexibility. When systems lose flexibility, small shocks become crises. Which path emerges depends on one thing: whether leverage is treated as a stabilizer or as an end in itself. And that distinction determines what comes next. Because systems don't fail loudly. They fail when no one can step back. That's why the final question isn't about power. It's about restraint. Restraint is the rarest form of power. Because when leverage becomes effortless, the temptation is to use it everywhere, to normalize pressure, to turn every advantage into a permanent weapon. But systems built only on coercion eventually lose what they need most: trust. And without trust, even the strongest mechanisms begin to grind. What we are witnessing is not a single confrontation. It is a test of whether global order is governed by balance or by exhaustion. Energy choke points, mineral leverage, technology gates. All of them work until they don't. The future will not be decided by who shouts the loudest or who threatens the most. It will be decided by who understands the system well enough to know when to stop pushing. If you want to make sense of the world you're living in and the pressures shaping it quietly, stay engaged. Share this perspective. Question the narratives that skip the mechanisms, because the next phase won't announce itself. And understanding it early is the only real advantage left. If this helped you see the system more clearly, you know what to do next.